My name is Amalinda Brown, and on the night of my 25th birthday, my father slid a piece of heavy, watermarked paper across a white linen tablecloth and told me I owed him $230,000. He called it an invoice for 18 years of raising me. I sat there in a Miami steakhouse, listening to the sizzle of seared meat from the next table, staring at the itemized list. Piano lessons, dental braces, private school tuition, even a calculated percentage of the Boca Raton property taxes, spanning from my birth until the day I left for college. My mother sat across from me, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, waiting for me to sign. What they did not know, as my father tapped his signet ring against the wood, demanding my signature, was that I spend my days auditing corporate fraud. And what I found hiding beneath that number is the part that still makes my hands shake. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance, where the quietest people in the room turn out to be the ones building the trap. If you have ever been made to feel like a financial burden by the people who were supposed to protect you, drop your age in the comments below, hit subscribe, and let me know. I am not alone, because the counter invoice I handed my father a few days later left him gasping for air. Let me back up so you understand the exact game they were trying to play. I am a senior forensic accountant here in Florida. My job is to find the missing money when wealthy people try to hide it. People pay me to be the smartest person in a room full of liars. But sitting in that booth at Prime 112, looking at my own parents, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The air conditioning was turned down low, but it was the document resting next to the silver bread basket that froze my blood. My father, Richard, wore his customary dark suit. The fabric caught the dim amber lighting, but his expression was tight and rehearsed. A mask of paternal authority that did not quite reach his eyes. Beside him, my older brother Harrison masked a smirk behind his wine glass. Harrison leaned forward, smelling of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. "Do not overthink it," Amalinda Harrison said. His voice was smooth and careless. "Dad financed your life. Now you are going to finance my equity. We need the reimbursement for the down payment on my new boat." I did not cry. I did not yell. A lesser accountant might have scoffed at the absurdity or assumed it was a cruel joke. Instead, my eyes bypassed the ridiculous line items for groceries and locked onto the fine print hovering just above the signature line. The heading did not say invoice. It read promissory note and release of claims. Below the total, a tiny paragraph stated that the undersigned hereby acknowledges receipt of said funds as historical living expenses and permanently waives all rights to audit review or contest prior family financial distributions. My pulse ticked in my throat. This was not a petty demand for cash to fund Harrison's lifestyle. It was a legal trap, a waiver. Someone needed me to legally validate a $230,000 sum, permanently shielding it from future scrutiny. "We need this signed and notarized by Friday," Richard added. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at his plate. Close of business. 72 hours. The strict deadline was the tell. Richard Brown built his entire reputation on the appearance of infinite generational wealth. Men with infinite wealth do not give their daughters 72-hour ultimatums to pay back the cost of childhood braces. He was operating on a ticking clock. My mother, Patricia, let out a soft sigh and touched my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Do not make this difficult, sweetie. It is just paperwork. It is a family duty. In my line of work, the first rule of survival is to let the opponent believe their snare succeeded." I picked up the document. I let my hands tremble just enough to convey the shock they expected to see. I lowered my chin, playing the part of the overwhelmed daughter perfectly. "I need to read this over," I said. My voice caught right on cue. It is just a lot to take in on my birthday. I folded the paper and tucked it carefully into my leather clutch. I signaled the waiter for the check. It was indeed just paperwork. But as I walked out into the humid night air, the real question echoing in my mind was not about childhood expenses. It was about what exactly that specific number was currently covering up, and why my own blood was willing to destroy me to hide it. The silence at the table stretched thick and suffocating until my older brother decided to fill it. Harrison leaned across the white linen, invading my personal space. The sharp scent of his designer cologne drifted over my plate, masking the aroma of the expensive food. It was a bold fragrance, meant for men who commanded respect in boardrooms. On my brother, it always smelled like a desperate apology for his lack of actual substance. "You are quiet tonight, little sister," Harrison mocked. His voice carried that familiar, arrogant drawl. He used that specific tone whenever he felt he held the winning hand. He picked up a pen from the table, a heavy gold Mont Blanc. He spun the expensive writing instrument between his knuckles, a nervous habit disguised as a display of dexterity. Our father gave him that pen 5 years ago to celebrate Harrison making junior partner at a boutique investment firm. I knew, for a fact, that our father secretly bankrolled that partnership, buying my brother a title he could never earn on his own merit. Harrison tapped the gold tip against the wood edge of the table. The metallic clink sounded like a countdown. "Do not play dumb, Amalinda," he continued, his eyes narrowing. "Dad floated your entire existence. You owe the family this reimbursement. We need the capital freed up immediately." I shifted my gaze past his smirking face to the woman sitting beside him. My sister-in-law Victoria usually dominated these family dinners. She was the type of woman who would loudly critique the sommelier, send back her appetizer twice, and ensure every patron within a 50-foot radius noticed her latest designer acquisition. Tonight, she was a ghost. Victoria sat rigidly upright, her pale hands resting in her lap. She had not touched her wine. Instead, her manicured fingers were systematically shredding a white cocktail napkin beneath the edge of the table. My forensic training kicked in, automatically filtering out my brother's obnoxious voice and focusing on the anomalies in the room. Why was Victoria terrified? My eyes drifted down to the empty leather chair beside her. Her handbag rested there. It was styled like a classic Hermes Birkin in matte black leather. At a passing glance, it radiated the kind of exclusive luxury my family worshipped. But my career relies on looking past the surface. I hunt for the hidden flaws in perfect corporate ledgers, and I apply that same scrutiny to the world around me. The leather on Victoria's bag lacked the subtle, buttery slouch of authentic calfskin. It held its shape a fraction too rigidly. I looked closer, my eyes tracking the saddle stitching along the side gusset. True luxury artisans sew with a specific technique that leaves a slight, deliberate angle to every thread. The stitching on the bag sitting in that chair was machined straight, flawless uniform, and entirely wrong. The gold hardware lacked the proper weight and sheen. It was a high-tier replica. A cold realization washed over me. Victoria was a woman who once threw a public tantrum because a department store placed her on a wait list for a silk scarf. She would never carry counterfeit leather unless she had no other choice. She would never suffer the indignity of a fake unless the real one had been quietly sold to cover a debt. The flawless facade of the Brown family fortune was cracking right in front of me. I brought my attention back to Harrison. I needed to test his narrative to see how deep the lies went. "You need $230,000 in liquid capital by Friday," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. I looked at the gold pen still spinning in his fingers. "What exactly is this reimbursement funding?" Harrison puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his suit. "I have a closing date on a custom azimut yacht by the end of the month. The equity transfer is holding up my marine loan. You need to sign the release so we can move the funds and finalize the purchase today." The lie was so sloppy, it was almost insulting to my intelligence. Marine lenders look at verified liquid assets and strict debt-to-income ratios. They do not care about fabricated promissory notes from younger siblings. You do not demand a daughter pay back childhood piano lessons to fund a luxury watercraft, and you certainly do not require a legal waiver of future audit rights to do it. Harrison was reciting lines someone else wrote for him. He was a bad actor in a play directed by our father. I glanced at my mother. Patricia was staring intently at the silver salt shaker, refusing to meet my eyes. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light, but her posture was defeated. My father was watching me with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator, waiting for the trap to snap shut. They were all in on the scheme. I picked up my leather clutch and carefully slid the folded document inside. I snapped the gold clasp shut. The sharp sound cut through the low murmur of the restaurant. "I am feeling a bit nauseous," I said, offering a tight, apologetic smile that I knew would enrage them. "It must be the rich food. I will review this paperwork tonight and let you know my thoughts in the morning." Before my father could issue another command or Harrison could raise his voice and cause a scene, I slid out of the leather booth. I smoothed the front of my dress, turned my back on my family, and walked away. I felt their eyes burning into my spine with every step I took toward the exit. The host held the heavy glass door open for me. I stepped out of the air-conditioned restaurant and into the thick, humid Miami night. The heat wrapped around me like a damp towel, but I shivered. The valet brought my car around a modest sedan that my family constantly mocked for lacking a European badge. I tipped the driver, climbed behind the steering wheel, and locked the doors. The neon lights of South Beach blurred through the windshield as I merged onto the causeway, heading toward my apartment in Brickell. The shock of the birthday ambush was beginning to fade, replaced by the precise machinery of my analytical mind. I gripped the steering wheel, turning the variables over and over. The 72-hour deadline, the forged urgency, the legal waiver hidden in the fine print, the fake designer handbag sitting on a steakhouse chair, the ridiculous story about a luxury yacht. I realized I had misread the situation inside the restaurant. When my father first slid that invoice across the table, I thought I was looking at pure, unadulterated greed. I thought they were simply trying to steal from me to fund their extravagant lifestyle. But greed is patient. Greed calculates long-term gains over years. Greed does not demand a signature by Friday afternoon over an expensive steak. The emotion radiating from Harrison, the tight posture of my mother, the terrifying stillness of Victoria. That was not greed. That was raw, unvarnished panic. The central question of the night shifted. This was not about petty cash. This was a matter of survival. Someone out there was bleeding my family dry. The debts were piling up faster than they could hide them, and the wolves were finally at the door. They were drowning, and they had gathered at Prime 112 to toss me over the side of the boat as a human anchor. They needed that specific amount of money to plug a hole in their sinking ship, and they were positioning me as the financial tourniquet. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I sped through the dark streets toward the financial district. They thought I was just a naive girl they could bully into submission through family guilt. They forgot that I spend my life dismantling elaborate financial schemes and tracking stolen funds across international borders. I was going to find out exactly what that $230,000 was meant to cover. My apartment was wired with the best encrypted servers money could buy. I planned to pour a cup of black coffee, open my laptop, and tear their entire hidden empire apart, line by line, until I found the rot hiding beneath their polished surface. The security doors of my Brickell high-rise slid shut behind me, sealing away the stifling Miami heat. I rode the elevator to the 32nd floor in silence. My reflection in the polished steel doors looked exactly like the corporate auditor my firm paid a premium for, poised, sharp, and stripped of sentiment. I unlocked my door and stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Biscayne Bay, a glittering expanse of dark water and scattered boat lights. I did not bother turning on the overhead fixtures. The ambient glow of the city was enough. I kicked off my heels, walked straight to the kitchen, and started the coffee machine. I needed caffeine, dark and bitter. I carried a steaming mug to the long oak dining table. I pushed aside a stack of unopened mail and a decorative centerpiece clearing the wood surface to create a sterile perimeter. I opened my briefcase, extracted my encrypted work laptop, and set it down. I unclasped my clutch and withdrew the folded invoice my father had handed me an hour earlier. I smoothed the heavy paper flat against the table. The red ink, spelling out $230,000, glared up at me in the dim light. I traced the edge of the document with my index finger. The time for playing the shocked daughter was over. I transformed my dining room into a war room. My fingers flew across the backlit keyboard. I bypassed the standard public search engines and logged directly into my firm's proprietary background query software. I needed to map the structural integrity of the Brown family finances. The logical place to strike first was the crown jewel of my father's supposed empire, the sprawling Boca Raton estate. It was a 10,000-square-foot Mediterranean revival mansion that hosted extravagant charity galas and political fundraisers. Richard Brown used that house to project an aura of untouchable prestige. I accessed the Palm Beach County Clerk database. I typed in the property address and initiated a title search. The initial result looked pristine, showing the deed held by a corporate entity named RB Holdings. To a casual observer, it appeared to be a standard wealth management trust. To a forensic accountant, an LLC holding a primary residence is often the first layer of a labyrinthine shell game. I ran a reverse trace on the registered agent for RB Holdings. That search directed me to a secondary corporation registered in Delaware. I peeled back the corporate layers one by one, tracing the structural obfuscation until I hit the bedrock of the property records. The screen refreshed. A cold chill traced the line of my spine. The boulder dropped with a quiet, digital click. A notice of lis pendens had been filed 30 days ago. It was a formal legal notification of pending litigation. The Boca Raton estate was in active pre-foreclosure. My heart hammered against my ribs. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the stark legal terminology. Richard had defaulted on a mezzanine loan 3 months prior. The bank was preparing to seize the property and auction it off. The grand mansion with its manicured lawns and marble foyers was a hollow shell. The untouchable wealth of the Brown family was an elaborate fiction sustained by rolling debt. My father was drowning. I sat back in my chair, sipping the scorching black coffee. The pre-foreclosure notice explained the desperation in my parents' eyes, but it did not explain the mechanics of the invoice. $230,000 was a significant sum, but it would not cure the arrears on a multi-million-dollar estate. The money was not meant to save the house. It was meant to be liquidated. I needed to shift my crosshairs. I targeted the weakest link in the chain, my brother, Harrison. Harrison was careless. Years ago, before I moved out, he had asked me to configure the virtual private network for his home office. He assumed I forgot the administrative credentials. I never forget a backdoor. I launched a secure terminal and pinged the IP address of his primary router. I slipped into his network traffic logs like a ghost. I was not looking for banking passwords. I was looking for patterns of panic. I isolated his recent digital footprint, filtering his outgoing server requests over the past 2 weeks. The data stream scrolled across my screen in bright green text. I scanned past the luxury car forums and the sports betting sites. Then, a specific outgoing email transmission snagged my attention. It was sent to a secure domain hosted by a law firm in downtown Miami. I recognized the firm immediately. They were high-end litigators infamous for handling brutal, scorched-earth asset divisions. They were divorce attorneys. I intercepted the residual cache of the correspondence. I decrypted the text file and read the contents. It was an intake questionnaire filled out by Harrison. He was inquiring about the legal mechanisms for shielding liquid capital prior to serving dissolution papers. The pieces snapped together, forming a brilliant and devastating picture. This was the red herring that made perfect sense of the evening. Harrison was preparing to blindside Victoria with a divorce. He was planning to discard her, but he needed to hide his cash reserves before the court-ordered discovery process froze his accounts. I thought back to the steakhouse. I remembered Victoria sitting rigidly in her chair, her trembling fingers tearing the napkin to shreds. I remembered the flawless replica handbag resting beside her. She knew. Victoria already knew her marriage was collapsing, and she knew Harrison was restricting her access to the authentic credit lines. She was terrified because she was about to be cast out with nothing. The stakes of the 72-hour deadline suddenly burned with intense clarity. The invoice my father handed me was an intricate laundering mechanism. If I signed that promissory note acknowledging a false debt of $230,000, I would be legally required to wire that exact amount into an account controlled by my father. Richard would then quietly funnel those funds into an offshore holding company owned by Harrison. When Victoria's divorce attorneys scoured the family ledgers, that money would be invisible. It would be legally classified as a repayment of historical debt, a settled family ledger, rendering it untouchable in a divorce settlement. They were using my signature to construct a financial firewall. If I caved to their pressure on Friday, my money would instantly vanish into Harrison's hidden shadow accounts, leaving Victoria destitute and making me an unwitting accomplice in hiding marital assets. I rubbed my tired eyes, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across the dining room. The logic was tight. It fit the behavior, the timeline, and the desperation. I felt the familiar thrill of the hunt, anticipating a classic divorce asset showdown. I had cracked the code. I reached for my coffee mug, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. I knew their game. But as I took another sip, my analytical mind caught on a jagged edge. Something in the equation remained unbalanced. I looked down at the physical paper resting on the table. The red ink. $230,000. In forensic accounting, random numbers do not exist. Fraudsters always pull figures from a source, whether it is an account balance, a tax threshold, or a specific liability. If Harrison merely needed to hide cash from a divorce judge, he would have demanded a round figure. $200,000. $250,000. The number on the invoice was too specific. It was calculated. It was exact. Why 230? The divorce theory explained the urgency, but it did not explain the mathematics. I closed the email cache and opened a new search terminal. The pre-foreclosure and the impending divorce were just symptoms of a much deeper rot. To understand the exact dollar amount, I needed to dig into the oldest financial roots of the Brown family tree. I needed to look at the money that existed before the debts began. I braced myself, typed in my late grandmother's legal name, and pressed enter, stepping blindly into a truth far more dangerous than a simple marital dispute. Dawn crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise, painting the walls of the apartment in pale shades of gray and lavender. The city of Miami was waking up, but I had never gone to sleep. My coffee had turned cold hours ago, leaving a bitter coating on my tongue. My eyes burned from the harsh glare of the monitor, yet my focus remained razor-sharp. The theory regarding Harrison shielding assets from a divorce explained the timeline. It explained the desperation. But it failed the mathematical test. $230,000 was a precise figure. In the world of forensic auditing, precision is a roadmap. It always points back to an origin point. I closed out of my brother's network traffic logs. I needed to pivot away from recent behavior and dig into the bedrock of my family's financial history. If my father needed that exact sum to balance a ledger, I had to find the ledger he was trying to balance. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the oak dining table, and initiated a secure tunnel protocol into the state of Florida's probate archives. Accessing these restricted municipal servers required navigating an archaic digital infrastructure, but my firm possessed the necessary credentials for federal compliance audits. I routed my connection through a series of masked proxies. The modern graphical interfaces vanished, replaced by stark green text on a black terminal screen. I typed in a name I had not spoken in nearly a decade. Josephine Vance, my maternal grandmother. Wait. The memory logs dictated I must avoid the name Vance. I backspaced, correcting my mental slip, before my fingers hit the keyboard. Josephine Sterling. That was her name. Josephine Sterling was a woman of iron and ink. She built a regional logistics empire from a single warehouse in the 1970s, navigating cutthroat industries with a shrewd, unforgiving intellect. She smelled of peppermint and starched linen, and she possessed a terrifying ability to read a person's character in seconds. She never approved of my father. Josephine often referred to Richard as a man who wore expensive suits to hide an empty wallet. She passed away during my freshman year of high school, leaving her considerable estate to my mother. The terminal blinked, displaying the digitized records of Josephine's probate settlement. I scrolled through the dense legal filings, scanning past the transfers of real estate and corporate dividends. Most of the wealth had indeed flowed directly to Patricia, who then predictably merged it with Richard's precarious investments. But Josephine was cautious. She knew her son-in-law was a financial parasite. I suspected she would have built a firewall. I ran a secondary search script within the probate file, looking for restricted codicils or sealed annexes. A hidden directory materialized at the bottom of the screen. It was an irrevocable, generation-skipping transfer trust, a ghost trust. These financial instruments are specifically designed to bypass irresponsible children and channel wealth directly to the grandchildren. I downloaded the encrypted PDF of the trust charter and opened it. The primary beneficiary was listed as Amalinda Brown. My breath caught in my throat. I read the stipulations outlined in my grandmother's precise, demanding legal phrasing. The trust was designed to remain sealed and managed by an independent fiduciary officer until the beneficiary reached the age of majority and demonstrated financial maturity. The vesting date was explicitly tied to a singular milestone. The funds were mandated to disperse in their entirety on my 25th birthday. Yesterday. I stared at the date on the screen, the digital numbers burning into my retinas. My father had invited me to a lavish steakhouse on the exact day this hidden trust was legally scheduled to mature. The coincidence was a mathematical impossibility. I navigated to the final page of the document to view the historical asset ledger. Josephine had seeded the account with a modest initial deposit, directing the trustee to invest the capital in conservative, high-yield municipal bonds. A neat column of numbers tracked the compound interest over the span of a decade. I scrolled down to the final projected balance calculated for the date of maturation, $230,000. The number mirrored the red ink on the invoice sitting next to my laptop, the exact dollar amount. I clicked over to the current account status, expecting to find the funds frozen or pending transfer. The ledger loaded, displaying a single stark digit, 0. The account was empty. I checked the transaction history. The money had not vanished yesterday. It had been systematically siphoned out 3 years ago in a series of swift, calculated wire transfers. The funds were routed through intermediary accounts and swallowed by the same offshore holding companies I suspected Harrison was using. The true horror of the situation crystallized in the quiet morning light. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. The document my father slid across the white linen tablecloth at Prime 112 was never a demand for cash. It was a retroactive shield. He was not trying to extort new money from me. He was trying to cover his tracks for a crime he committed years ago. When a ghost trust reaches its maturation date, the independent trustee is legally obligated to initiate a formal handover. If the funds are missing, an automated federal audit is triggered. Richard knew the auditors would knock on his door the moment I turned 25. To avoid a federal indictment for embezzlement, he needed an airtight paper trail proving that the beneficiary had received the full value of the trust. He decided to disguise his theft as historical child care. By forcing me to sign that promissory note and release of claims, Richard was attempting to legally classify the stolen inheritance as living expenses dispersed over the course of my childhood. The document stated I acknowledged receipt of the funds. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I would legally testify that my parents spent my grandmother's money on my piano lessons, my braces, and my private school tuition. I would waive my right to ever ask where the actual cash went. My own father was trying to make me launder my stolen inheritance. He sat across from me, drinking fine wine, acting like a disappointed patriarch, while attempting to manipulate me into signing away a federal felony. He used my birthday as a deadline for his own salvation. A profound shift occurred within me during that quiet morning hour. The lingering attachment to the family that raised me burned away, leaving nothing but cold ash. The obedient, eager-to-please daughter died in that chair overlooking Biscayne Bay. In her place, the apex predator awoke. I am a corporate forensic accountant. I dismantle corrupt empires for a living. I track hidden liabilities, expose fraudulent ledgers, and ruin the lives of arrogant men who think they can outsmart the math. I was no longer a grieving child trying to understand why her parents were so cruel. I was the victim of a calculated financial crime, and I was preparing to hunt down the people who robbed me. But a new obstacle immediately presented itself. My grandmother was thorough. A ghost trust cannot be liquidated by a parent without the explicit, authorized consent of the named beneficiary. Richard could not have bypassed the independent trustee just by asking nicely. He needed documentation. He needed a mechanism of withdrawal. I leaned back toward the screen, my fingers flying over the keys. I bypassed the ledger and dug into the digitized banking records attached to the closed probate file. I needed to see the exact paperwork submitted to the bank 3 years ago. I found a subfolder labeled Authorization Requisitions. I opened the PDF containing the primary wire transfer request. The document authorized the liquidation of the municipal bonds and the transfer of all liquid capital to an external account controlled by RB Holdings. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page, searching for the verification signature. My own name stared back at me. Amalinda Brown. The loops and slants mimicked my handwriting, but the pressure of the pen strokes was entirely wrong. It was a forgery. A desperate, hurried forgery executed 3 years ago to steal my future. Before I could fully process the gravity of the falsified signature, the heavy silence of the apartment was shattered. My personal cell phone, resting face down on the oak table, began to vibrate against the wood. The sudden mechanical buzzing sent a spike of adrenaline through my chest. I picked up the device and looked at the screen. The caller ID displayed the name of my mother's older sister, Aunt Beatrice. She was calling at 6 in the morning. Beatrice was a woman who never reached out unless the sky was falling. I stared at the glowing screen, realizing the storm I was tracking had just made landfall. The device vibrated against the solid oak table. The sudden mechanical buzzing shattered the heavy silence of the early morning. I stared at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a single name, Beatrice. She is my mother's older sister, an African-American woman who built a chain of independent pharmacies across the state of Florida through sheer pragmatism and an iron will. Beatrice possessed zero tolerance for the country club illusions Richard spun to secure his social standing. She dealt in hard inventory and verified ledgers. She never called before sunrise unless a catastrophic event had occurred. I picked up the device and accepted the connection. I held the speaker to my ear, listening to the faint hiss of cellular static. "Are you awake?" Amalinda Beatrice asked. Her voice lacked its usual warm cadence. It sounded tight and carefully controlled. The tone resembled a doctor delivering a grim medical diagnosis. "I am awake," I replied. I kept my gaze fixed on the forged signature glaring from my laptop monitor. "I have been working all night." Beatrice exhaled a long breath. "Your mother called me 4 hours ago. It was 2 in the morning. Patricia never calls me at that hour, and she certainly never calls me sounding like a cornered animal. She abandoned every ounce of that refined etiquette she spends so much money polishing. She was weeping Amalinda, genuine, unscripted panic. A cold sensation spread outward from my chest. What did she want? I asked. She begged for a bridge loan. Beatrice stated flatly, she asked for 6 figures. She promised exorbitant interest returns within 30 days, claiming Richard had a temporary liquidity freeze due to a pending real estate acquisition. But her story fell apart the moment she gave me the routing instructions. She did not want the funds sent to their domestic wealth management account. She demanded a direct wire transfer to a Caribbean clearinghouse, a Bahamian registry. I closed my eyes. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, realigning into a terrifying new configuration. "Did you send the funds?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I am a businesswoman, not a charity for reckless gamblers," Beatrice replied. I told her no. Patricia became hysterical. She said if they did not secure the capital by Friday, they would lose everything, not just the Boca Raton house, everything. I am calling to warn you, Amalinda. When a ship that size begins to take on water, the captain will throw anyone overboard to stay afloat. Watch your back." I thanked my aunt and ended the call. The device slipped from my fingers, clattering softly onto the oak surface. The theory regarding Harrison preparing for a contentious divorce dissolved into dust. My brother was not hiding assets from Victoria. The offshore legal firm was not a shield against a bitter spouse. The crisis was systemic. The entire Brown family was tied to the same sinking anchor. The Bahamian routing instructions Beatrice mentioned matched the geopolitical profile of unregulated cryptocurrency syndicates. Such offshore entities demand immense capital reserves and operate outside the jurisdiction of federal oversight. If Richard and Harrison leveraged their domestic assets to play in unregulated international markets, a sudden market collapse would trigger catastrophic margin calls. Creditors in those jurisdictions do not send polite collection letters. They seize collateral with ruthless efficiency. The realization triggered a visceral memory. The mention of Richard gambling with unverified capital unlocked a door in my mind I had kept sealed for a decade. I was 15 years old. It was a humid Sunday afternoon in July. The air conditioning inside my grandmother's previous residence hummed a steady, low note. The kitchen smelled intensely of fresh peppermint and steeped Earl Grey tea. Josephine Sterling sat at the sprawling marble island. She wore a tailored linen blouse, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. A thick, leather-bound ledger rested open in front of her. I stood by the refrigerator pouring a glass of cold water. Outside, through the expansive glass patio doors, my father paced near the swimming pool. Richard held a phone to his ear, laughing loudly, gesturing with his free hand as he boasted about a guaranteed return on a speculative land development deal. Josephine watched him through the glass. Her posture radiated predatory stillness. She did not blink. She simply studied my father the way a hawk studies a snake moving through tall grass. "Amia, come here," Josephine said. She always used that private nickname for me, a subtle way of claiming my identity apart from the Brown family name. I walked over to the marble island. Josephine tapped a manicured fingernail against the open pages of her ledger. The columns were filled with her elegant, precise handwriting. "Listen to that man out there," Josephine instructed, her voice dropping to a hushed, stern whisper. "He speaks of wealth as if it is magic. He believes confidence can replace collateral. Richard is a parasite wearing a silk tie. He bets with money that has not been printed yet, Amia. Watch your name." At 15, I assumed she meant I should protect my reputation. I thought she was warning me to avoid his arrogant behavior, to build my own legacy, free from his shallow social climbing. I nodded, promising her I would be careful, not fully comprehending the gravity of her instruction. Now, sitting in my Brickell high-rise 10 years later, staring at the glowing monitor, the true meaning of her warning crashed over me. Watch your name. Josephine knew. She possessed a terrifying ability to read a person's character, and she saw the terminal rot festering inside my father. She knew Richard viewed every asset around him as potential leverage for his next gamble. She knew he would eventually exhaust his own credit and begin hunting for fresh, unguarded capital. That was why she designed the Ghost Trust. She built a financial vault meant to remain locked until I reached an age of legal maturity, hoping to shield my inheritance from his predatory reach. But she underestimated his desperation. I looked at the digitized banking requisition on my laptop screen. The falsified signature glared back at me. Amalinda Brown. He literally stole my name. Richard forged my identity to bypass the institutional safeguards draining the vault dry 3 years ago. The anger crystallizing inside me hardened into something cold, operational, and unforgiving. This was not a sudden mistake born of recent financial hardship. The betrayal was premeditated. They viewed my future security not as a sacred trust, but as an emergency slush fund to finance their toxic offshore syndicates. The invoice handed to me at the steakhouse was the final calculated step in a multi-year conspiracy to launder their crime through my own signature. I was the only person equipped to excise this infection. My career trained me to dismantle corrupt empires. I possess the forensic skills to trace the stolen funds across international borders, to link the Bahamian routing numbers to the forged probate withdrawals, and to document every illegal maneuver they executed. I needed to gather the physical proof. I reached for my keyboard, preparing to run a cross-reference algorithm matching the offshore holding companies to my brother's network traffic logs. Before my fingers touched the keys, the lobby intercom mounted on my apartment wall chimed. The sharp electronic tone echoed through the quiet room. I stood up and walked to the security panel. I pressed the video display button. The screen flickered to life, showing the high-definition feed from the ground floor reception desk. My mother, Patricia, stood in the marble lobby. She wore a designer trench coat, her posture rigid, her face drawn and tight. She was holding a plastic bakery box. She bypassed the standard guest protocol, demanding the concierge grant her immediate access to the residential elevators. The early morning ambush was shifting from the theoretical realm of digital ledgers to my physical sanctuary. Beatrice was right. Desperate people do not retreat. The clock was accelerating, and the perpetrators were bringing the war directly to my front door. I pressed the release button on the security panel. The heavy electronic lock of the lobby door disengaged with a dull thud. On the video feed, another figure stepped into the frame, joining my mother, Victoria. My sister-in-law wore a beige trench coat pulled tight around her waist, her face hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses despite the early morning hour. They entered the elevator bank. I had exactly 3 minutes to hide my war room. I folded my laptop shut, swept the printed probate records into a leather portfolio, and shoved the entire stack inside a designated credenza drawer. I wiped down the oak dining table, leaving only the cold mug of coffee. By the time of the private elevator announced their arrival on my floor, the apartment looked like a serene, undisturbed sanctuary. I opened my front door. Patricia stood on the threshold. The artificial smile plastered across her face looked brittle, like cracked porcelain. Victoria hovered a step behind her, radiating a frantic, nervous energy. "Happy late birthday, sweetheart," my mother chirped. Her voice held a synthetic sweetness that set my teeth on edge. She thrust a plastic bakery box into my hands. I looked down at the offering. The Brown family traditionally celebrated milestones with custom, tiered creations from an exclusive French patisserie in Coral Gables pastries adorned with edible gold leaf and spun sugar. The box resting in my palms contained a generic sheet cake. The bright blue icing spelling out my name was smeared against the clear plastic lid. A printed barcode sticker from a discount grocery chain remained affixed to the side. It was a glaring neon sign of their catastrophic liquidity crisis. Patricia Brown would rather skip a social event than be seen purchasing baked goods from a strip mall. The illusion of their wealth was disintegrating rapidly. I invited them inside, maintaining an expression of pleasant surprise. Victoria stepped past me, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. She kept her sunglasses on, scanning the open floor plan of my high-rise as if searching for hidden surveillance. I guided them toward the living area, directing them to the plush velvet sofa overlooking the bay. I offered to brew a pot of herbal tea. My mother agreed, her hands fluttering nervously as she set her designer handbag onto the glass coffee table. I walked into the open kitchen, retrieving a porcelain tea set. I could hear them whispering in the adjacent room, the rapid exchange of conspirators finalizing their strategy. I filled the kettle and set it to boil. When I carried the silver tray back into the living room, Patricia had arranged her features into a mask of deep maternal concern. She patted the empty cushion beside her, motioning for me to sit. "Linda," she began, her tone dripping with manufactured empathy. "I know last night felt abrupt. Your father handles business matters with a certain bluntness, but you must understand the immense pressure he carries. He built a legacy to protect all of us." She reached out, placing her cool palm over my hand. The gesture felt calculated and hollow. "Richard is aging," she continued, her eyes glistening with forced tears. "His blood pressure is soaring. The financial markets are so volatile right now, and he spends every waking moment trying to shield this family from the stress. That document he brought to dinner is just a formality, a simple accounting requirement to keep his corporate ledgers balanced. It would bring him so much peace of mind if you just signed it. She would weaponizing family guilt, utilizing the classic tactics of a skilled manipulator. She painted the man who stole my inheritance as a vulnerable, self-sacrificing patriarch. I kept my face blank, adopting the posture of a naive, compliant child. I lowered my gaze, nodding slowly, as if absorbing her profound wisdom. "I understand, Mom," I whispered, injecting a slight tremor into my vocal cords. I just felt overwhelmed. It was a large number to process over a birthday dinner. Patricia squeezed my fingers, exhaling a breath of evident relief. "Of course it was," she soothed. "But it is just numbers on a page, sweetie. Internal bookkeeping. You know your father would never ask you for anything unless it was vital for our infrastructure." I poured the steaming liquid into the delicate porcelain cups, handing one to my mother and offering the other to Victoria. As I leaned forward, my line of sight aligned perfectly with the glass coffee table. Patricia had left her purse unclasped. The leather flaps parted, revealing a chaotic jumble of cosmetics keys and loose papers. My forensic instincts zeroed in on a specific crumpled receipt shoved near the side pocket. The top of the paper bore the distinct embossed logo of a prominent Caribbean legal group, the same offshore region my Aunt Beatrice had referenced hours earlier. I shifted my position, pretending to adjust the silver sugar bowl, narrowing my focus to read the printed text. The billing details were crystal clear. It was a retainer fee. The memo line explicitly stated the charge was for rapid asset liquidation and corporate shielding. The geographical coordinates were printed right below the firm name, Nassau, Bahamas. The puzzle pieces slammed into place. The Bahamian attorney was the architect of their escape plan. Richard and Harrison were using that firm to dissolve their remaining domestic holdings and shelter whatever cash they could salvage from their toxic investments. They needed my signature on the promissory note to legitimize the missing $230,000, funneling it straight into that Nassau account before the federal auditors or the domestic creditors could freeze their assets. I sat back, taking a slow sip of my tea. The hot liquid burned my throat, matching the silent fury igniting in my chest. I had the exact destination of the stolen money. I smiled at my mother, the picture of docile obedience. "I will look over the paperwork tonight," I promised. "I want to help ease his burden." Patricia beamed, her brittle demeanor relaxing into genuine triumph. She finished her tea in 3 quick swallows, eager to escape the charade now that she believed the objective was secured. She gathered her purse, snapping the clasp shut, ignorant of the lethal intelligence she had just delivered into my hands. Victoria stood up alongside her. The sister-in-law had remained mute during the performance, her body language rigid and defensive. I escorted them back to the front door. Patricia embraced me, a perfumed hug lacking any real warmth, and stepped out into the hallway. Victoria lingered on the threshold. She pushed her oversized sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, revealing dark, exhausted circles beneath her eyes. The mask of the haughty socialite was gone, replaced by raw, untreated desperation. Victoria leaned close to my ear. Her breath smelled of stale coffee and fear. "Do not stall Amalinda," she hissed, her voice a sharp, jagged whisper. "You do not understand the people Richard is dealing with right now. If that document is not executed by Friday, the creditors will not just take the Boca Raton house. They will come for everything we own. Sign the paper. Do not test us." I held her gaze, offering a blank, unreadable stare. "I will see you on Friday," I replied. Victoria pulled back her eyes, darting nervously before she turned and hurried down the corridor to join my mother. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing them outside in the pristine hallway. The pressure cooker was whistling, the deadline was real, the threats were escalating, and the perpetrators were shedding their polite disguises. I walked back to the kitchen and threw the discount grocery cake directly into the trash bin. The brief, unannounced visit provided everything I needed. I bypassed the living room and returned to my dining table. I retrieved the hidden probate files and my laptop from the cabinet. I now possessed the geographical coordinates of their illicit financial sanctuary. The Bahamian legal firm was the weak point in their armor. I opened a fresh terminal window, preparing to hack into the offshore registry. The defensive phase of this war was officially over. It was time to hunt. The silence in my apartment felt different now. It was no longer the quiet of a sanctuary, but the stillness of a war room right before a strike. I sat back down at the long oak table, pushing my cold coffee mug aside. The crumpled receipt from my mother's purse had provided the exact coordinates of their escape route. Nassau. The capital of the Bahamas is a notorious haven for hidden wealth, a place where shell companies breed in the dark. I woke my encrypted laptop from its sleep mode. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing standard public search engines. I accessed a proprietary database utilized by my firm for international compliance audits. Offshore registries are designed to be impenetrable, constructed with layers of nominal directors and anonymous bearer shares. However, no digital fortress is flawless. When a domestic entity transfers capital across borders, it leaves a faint electronic footprint. I initiated a search string targeting the specific Caribbean legal group printed on the receipt, cross-referencing it with the names of my father and brother over a 36-month window. The query ran for several tense minutes. The loading icons spun against the dark background of the terminal screen. I listened to the faint hum of the city traffic drifting up from the streets of Miami. Then the results populated. A single corporate entity materialized. RBH International Holdings. The registered officers were listed clearly. Richard Brown acted as the primary guarantor. Harrison Brown was named as the managing director. I opened the incorporation documents. The filing date matched the exact month my grandmother's ghost trust was drained 3 years ago. I executed a deeper trace, probing the transactional history of RBH International. I needed to map the trajectory of the stolen inheritance. The ledger loaded, displaying a singular incoming wire transfer originating from a domestic account. The amount was exactly $230,000. I watched the screen, anticipating the next move. Wealthy men seeking a safe harbor for illicit funds typically park their capital in stable offshore real estate or conservative foreign index funds. But Richard and Harrison were not seeking stability. They were chasing a miracle. The outgoing ledger revealed the true destination of the stolen money. It did not go into a traditional investment portfolio. The entire sum was wired directly to an unregulated digital asset exchange, a cryptocurrency syndicate operating outside the jurisdiction of federal oversight. The revelation hit me with the force of a speeding train. The elaborate theory I had constructed regarding Harrison preparing for a bitter divorce crumbled into dust. My brother was not hiding marital assets from Victoria. He had lost the assets entirely. Richard and Harrison had taken my inheritance and treated it like casino chips. They plunged the $230,000 into a highly volatile, leveraged cryptocurrency derivative market. They bet on phantom digital yields, hoping to multiply the stolen funds and cover their existing debts before anyone noticed the trust was empty. But the crypto market is ruthless. 18 months ago, the specific syndicate they invested with suffered a catastrophic liquidity crash. When you trade on margin in an unregulated exchange, a severe market downturn triggers an immediate margin call. The broker demands actual cash to cover the digital deficit. If you cannot provide the capital, your position is liquidated and you owe the balance. I pulled up the historical pricing charts for their chosen digital asset. The line graph resembled a steep cliff. Their investment had not just dipped, it had evaporated. This explained the secondary crisis. The margin call must have been immense. To prevent the offshore syndicate from freezing their remaining accounts and pursuing their domestic assets, Richard needed to provide fresh collateral. He possessed no liquid cash. He only had the illusion of wealth. I cross-referenced the dates of the cryptocurrency crash with the property records for the Boca Raton estate. The timeline aligned with terrifying precision. Richard had not defaulted on a standard residential mortgage. He had secretly leveraged the family mansion, securing a high-risk mezzanine loan from a shadow lender. He took the cash from that loan and fed it directly into the gaping maw of the offshore crypto syndicate, desperately trying to keep their leveraged positions afloat. It was a classic sunk cost fallacy executed on a monumental scale. And it failed. The offshore syndicate collapsed anyway, taking all of their capital down with it. Now the shadow lender who held the note on the Boca Raton estate was calling the debt due. That was the origin of the pre-foreclosure notice. The people Richard owed money to were not polite bankers willing to negotiate extensions. They were relentless, unregulated creditors who specialized in dismantling distressed portfolios. They were threatening to seize everything the Brown family owned. The puzzle was finally whole. The Friday deadline was not an arbitrary date selected to ruin my birthday. It was the absolute deadline set by the shadow lender. If Richard and Harrison filed for bankruptcy to stall the foreclosure, the federal courts would mandate a forensic accounting of their entire financial history. The auditors would inevitably discover the drained ghost trust. They would see the forged signature. The bankruptcy proceedings would instantly transform into a federal criminal investigation for embezzlement and wire fraud. That was why they needed me. They required a firewall. The invoice my father handed me at Prime 112 was the key to their survival. If I signed the promissory note and release of claims, I would legally legitimize the initial theft. The document would serve as sworn testimony that the $230,000 was spent on my childhood living expenses, not funneled into a Bahamian crypto syndicate. It would balance the historical ledger. The IRS and the federal auditors would see a clean, settled family trust. My signature would grant Richard the legal cover he needed to restructure his debts without triggering a prison sentence. I sat motionless in the quiet apartment, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their deception. The villains in this story were not merely greedy socialites trying to maintain a lavish lifestyle. They were terrified, cornered animals. They were staring down the barrel of federal indictments and the total destruction of their freedom. People facing those kinds of consequences do not possess boundaries. They do not care about familial bonds or moral obligations. They will destroy anything standing between them and their survival. My mother crying in my living room, Victoria whispering threats at my door, Harrison mocking me over a steak dinner. Every action was driven by raw, unadulterated terror. This midpoint realization shifted my entire operational paradigm. I was no longer dealing with a simple case of stolen inheritance. I was standing in the path of a collapsing financial empire. If I refused to sign the document on Friday, they would not just scold me. They would deploy every weapon in their arsenal to force my compliance or destroy my credibility before I could expose them. I could not simply say no. I could not just walk away and let the creditors tear them apart, because doing so would leave me vulnerable to their desperate retaliation. I needed to design a countermeasure. I had to construct a legal snare that would use their own momentum against them. I needed to force my father into a position where executing his fraudulent document became the exact mechanism of his own demise. I closed the offshore registry portal. The screen went black, reflecting my own resolute expression. The hunt required a new strategy. I needed to analyze the specific phrasing of their trap and find the fatal flaw hidden in their legal architecture. I reached for my notepad, uncapped a pen, and began to draft the blueprint for their execution. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains closed, sealing the bright Miami morning outside. My high-rise apartment descended into a cool, artificial twilight. I needed sensory deprivation. I required an environment devoid of distraction to dismantle the legal snare my parents had constructed. I turned on a single brass desk lamp. The focused beam of light illuminated the long oak dining table. I took the promissory note out of my leather clutch and placed it in the center of the illuminated circle. The document was a masterpiece of predatory simplicity. My father had hired a very expensive attorney to draft this single sheet of paper. I traced the edge of the thick watermark with my index finger, analyzing the trap the way a bomb technician studies a complex circuit board. The genius of Richard's strategy resided in the binary choice he presented. He offered me 2 doors, and both of them led to a slaughterhouse. I mapped out the first option. I refused to sign. If I simply walked away and let the Friday deadline expire, the shadow lenders would seize the Boca Raton estate. The offshore cryptocurrency syndicate would liquidate the remaining collateral. The resulting bankruptcy would trigger a federal audit, and the authorities would uncover the drained ghost trust. Richard and Harrison would face federal indictments for embezzlement. A naive person might assume that outcome meant I won. I knew better. Richard was an apex narcissist. If he went down, he would drag me into the abyss with him. He would unleash a scorched earth smear campaign across the Florida financial sector. He would utilize his extensive country club network to paint me as an ungrateful, sociopathic daughter who hoarded her grandmother's wealth while her aging parents faced the street. He would file frivolous civil lawsuits claiming I breached an oral contract to support them. The litigation would drag on for years. My accounting firm would distance themselves to avoid the negative press. I would be professionally ruined and socially exiled. I mapped out the second option. I surrender and sign the document. I picked up a red felt pen and highlighted the specific waiver clause hovering above the signature line. By placing my name on that dotted line, I would legally certify that the $230,000 was dispersed directly to me for educational and historical living expenses. If I did that, the federal ledger would balance. The auditors would see a settled family trust. Richard would use the clean paperwork to restructure his debt, securing a new line of credit to hold off the shadow lenders. He would survive. But my signature would transform me from a victim into a co-conspirator. Under the federal statutes governing wire fraud, signing a document you know to be false in order to facilitate a financial transaction makes you an accessory after the fact. If the authorities ever discovered the Bahamian routing numbers down the road, they would pull this promissory note from the archives. They would look at my signature. They would note my occupation as a senior forensic accountant. A judge would never believe I was just a naive daughter who signed a paper without reading it. The prosecution would argue I willingly participated in the money laundering scheme. I would lose my certified public accountant license. I would face a mandatory minimum prison sentence. My father was handing me a loaded weapon and demanding I aim it at my own chest to save his skin. I set the red pen down. My chest tightened. The dry air from the air conditioning vent blew across my face. Neither the first nor the second option was acceptable. I refused to be a martyr, and I refused to be a criminal. I needed a third path. I stood up and paced the length of the hardwood floor. I thought about the mechanics of the impending Friday meeting. Richard would host the gathering at the Boca Raton estate. He would want home court advantage. He would arrange the seating to maximize psychological pressure. My mother would perform her weeping routine. Harrison would provide physical intimidation. But a legal document of this magnitude requires authentication. Richard could not just accept my signature in private. To make the promissory note legally binding and airtight against a federal audit, he needed an impartial witness. He needed a notary public. I stopped pacing. The realization struck me like a physical blow. A notary public in the state of Florida is an appointed official. They are legally mandated to verify the identity of the signers and ensure the document is executed without duress. More importantly, executing a financial document containing a material lie in the presence of a state official elevates the act from a private dispute to a verifiable crime. It is called fraud in the inducement. I walked back to the oak table and leaned over the document, reading the specific phrasing of the disbursement clause again. Funds dispersed to accounts managed by the undersigned. That was the fatal flaw in their legal architecture. The wording was vague. It did not list a specific bank routing number. It relied on a generalized statement. If I simply refused to sign, Richard could claim I was being obstinate. But what if I showed up to the meeting and acted like I was ready to comply? What if I held the pen over the paper, surrounded by witnesses with the notary's stamp waiting on the table? If I asked Richard a direct, granular question about the exact destination of the funds right before I signed, he would be forced to answer. He could not tell the truth. He could not say the money went to a Bahamian cryptocurrency exchange. He would have to invent a lie on the spot to appease the notary and maintain the illusion. He would have to name a specific, fabricated, domestic bank account. By stating a verifiable lie out loud in front of an appointed state official while attempting to secure a signature on a financial contract, Richard would commit perjury. He would trap himself on the record. He would provide me with the exact legal ammunition I needed to void the document and trigger an immediate criminal injunction. A cold, methodical calm washed over me. I finally had the blueprint for my counterstrike. I was not going to run from the Friday meeting. I was going to walk straight into their stronghold and hand them the shovel they would use to dig their own graves. I needed to construct my own paperwork. I opened a fresh document on my laptop. I began drafting a counter-invoice. I tallied the original stolen principal, $230,000. I calculated a decade of standard compound interest. I added strict punitive damages for the emotional duress and the attempted extortion. I factored in my firm's standard forensic auditing fee of $800 an hour for the time I spent unraveling their offshore syndicate. The grand total climbed, rapidly surpassing $1 million. It was a staggering figure. It was a legally binding demand letter, heavily documented with the offshore corporate registry screenshots and the forged probate records. I saved the file. The defensive posture was gone. I was assembling a financial guillotine. I reached for my coffee mug, feeling the first genuine surge of confidence since the birthday dinner. The strategy was airtight. The logic was sound. I just needed to maintain my composure for 48 more hours. Then my phone illuminated on the table. It was not a call from a terrified relative. It was a secure notification from my accounting firm's internal human resources portal. I frowned, setting the mug down. Corporate notifications rarely arrived before standard business hours unless an emergency protocol had been triggered. I picked up the device and tapped the screen, authenticating my biometric credentials. The message loaded. The text was terse and stripped of any professional warmth. I was instructed to surrender my corporate access badge and restrict my remote server logins immediately. I had been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending an urgent review by the State Ethical Oversight Committee. My pulse spiked. Richard had not waited for Friday. He had launched a preemptive strike. He knew I might hesitate, so he decided to cripple my professional authority to force my hand. He had filed a fabricated grievance against my license, accusing me of financial malpractice. The narrative pole shifted violently. My father thought he had just paralyzed me. He thought he had severed my access to the resources I needed to fight him. As I read the formal suspension notice in the dim light of my apartment, a slow, predatory smile touched my lips. Richard Brown had just made the final, fatal miscalculation of his life. He had no idea what kind of dormant corporate machinery he had just awakened. The morning sun reflected off the glass facades of the Miami financial district, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. Thursday had arrived. I walked into the sprawling marble lobby of my accounting firm, blending into the flow of executives and junior analysts. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans and expensive leather briefcases. It was an environment built on routine and precision. I approached the security turnstiles, holding my corporate identification badge against the electronic reader. I expected the familiar green light and the soft chime, granting me access to the elevators. Instead, a harsh red light flared on the display panel. A low, discordant buzz echoed from the machine. The glass barrier remained locked. I tried scanning the badge a second time. The red light flashed again. A heavy hand settled on my shoulder. I turned and faced the head of building security. He did not offer his usual morning greeting. His expression was carefully neutral. He gestured toward a secondary corridor leading away from the main lobby. He told me Human Resources requested my immediate presence in a private conference room. My pulse quickened, but I kept my breathing even. I followed the security chief down the quiet hallway, my heels sinking into the thick carpet. We reached a room constructed entirely of frosted glass. The door opened. The director of human resources sat at a round granite table. Beside her sat the senior managing partner of my division. The presence of a managing partner indicated a crisis of severe magnitude. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, stripped of all professional warmth and pleasantries. The managing partner did not offer me a seat. He simply pushed a thick manila folder across the smooth stone surface. "We received a formal grievance this morning," Amalinda, the managing partner, stated. His voice was clinical and detached. It was filed directly with the State Ethical Oversight Board and forwarded to our legal department. The allegations are substantial. I looked down at the folder. The name of the complainant was printed in bold black ink on the top sheet: Richard Brown. My father had not waited for the Friday deadline. He recognized my hesitation at the steakhouse and decided to launch a preemptive nuclear strike. He wanted to paralyze my career, sever my income, and humiliate me into submission. "Read the summary the Human Resources Director instructed." I opened the file. The legal phrasing was meticulously crafted, undoubtedly written by the same expensive attorney who drafted the promissory note. Richard accused me of financial elder abuse. The document outlined a fabricated narrative where I utilized my specialized accounting knowledge to manipulate family trusts, isolate my aging parents, and coerce them into surrendering their retirement assets. He painted himself as a terrified, vulnerable patriarch, desperately trying to protect his family legacy from a sociopathic daughter. "Effective immediately, you are placed on indefinite administrative leave," the managing partner continued, offering no room for debate. "You must surrender your corporate access badge. Your remote server credentials have been revoked. We are legally obligated to suspend your duties pending an urgent and thorough review by the State Committee." This was Richard playing his trump card. He believed he had cornered me. He assumed that by stripping away my professional identity and threatening my certified public accountant license, I would break. He thought I would rush to the Boca Raton estate on Friday, sign his fraudulent release to appease him, and beg him to withdraw the grievance. I needed to sell the illusion that his strategy worked. I needed the firm to report my devastation back to the board. I let my shoulders slump. I widened my eyes, forcing a rapid, shallow breathing pattern that simulated a rising panic attack. I allowed a single tear to spill over my lower lash line, tracing a path down my cheek. I shook my head, my hands trembling, as I reached for my corporate badge. "This is a misunderstanding," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "My father is under immense stress. I would never betray my fiduciary duty. Please do not take my credentials." The Human Resources Director offered a look of practiced sympathy, but she did not reach out to comfort me. Corporate protocol dictated strict distance during an active investigation. She slid a small cardboard box across the table, instructing me to pack any personal items from my desk under the supervision of the security chief. I nodded, wiping my face with the back of my hand. I placed my access badge on the granite table. I played the part of the ruined professional all the way to the service elevator. I carried the cardboard box out the rear exit of the building, keeping my head bowed in shame as I walked toward my parked car. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. The heavy soundproofing of the sedan isolated me from the noise of the city. I set the cardboard box on the passenger seat. I reached up and wiped the artificial tear from my cheek. The mask of the devastated daughter vanished. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I gripped the steering wheel, letting out a sharp bark of triumphant laughter that echoed in the quiet cabin. Richard Brown thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he possessed the strategic high ground. He possessed no idea what kind of dormant corporate machinery he had just awakened. My father was a man who relied on country club networking and social intimidation. He understood the optics of power, but he fundamentally misunderstood the rigid mechanical laws governing modern financial institutions. He assumed an ethics complaint was just a mechanism for bad public relations. As a senior forensic auditor, I knew the hidden protocols governing top-tier financial firms. When a formal accusation of financial elder abuse is levied against a licensed employee, the firm cannot simply conduct a quiet internal interview. Federal regulations mandate an immediate, uncompromising response. The moment Human Resources processed Richard's grievance, a silent alarm tripped deep within the corporate infrastructure. The complaint automatically transferred from Human Resources to the Anti-Money Laundering Division. The compliance officers in that division operate with absolute autonomy and federal authority. Their mandate is to protect the institution from any association with illicit funds. To verify if I had engaged in elder abuse, the Compliance Division was now legally required to run a deep federal-level audit on the accuser. They had to investigate Richard to determine if his assets were actually missing. By filing that grievance, my father had just granted a team of ruthless forensic investigators the legal authorization to comb through his entire financial history. They would pull his tax returns. They would subpoena his bank records. They would trace the origins of his mezzanine loan on the Boca Raton estate. Within 24 hours, the Anti-Money Laundering Division would detect the massive capital hemorrhage. They would uncover the wire transfers leading to the Caribbean Holding Company. They would identify the unregulated cryptocurrency syndicate in Nassau. Once a financial institution discovers offshore routing numbers associated with a domestic fraud claim, their legal obligation is absolute. They do not ask for clarification. They file a suspicious activity report directly with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The Federal Bureau of Investigation receives an automated copy of that report. My father tried to build a cage to trap me. Instead, he constructed a pristine, illuminated runway, leading federal agents directly to his hidden offshore syndicate. He handed the authorities the keys to his own destruction, and he did it under his own signature. I turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life. The dramatic irony was intoxicating. I did not need to hack into any more databases or risk exposure by gathering stolen records. The full weight of the United States federal government was currently mobilizing against the Brown family, and Richard had personally invited them to the slaughter. I drove back to my Brickell high-rise feeling invincible. The 72-hour deadline was no longer a ticking time bomb threatening my survival. It was the countdown to their execution. I rode the elevator up to my apartment, leaving the cardboard box in the trunk of my car. I did not need my corporate desk anymore. My dining room table was the only battlefield that mattered. I walked inside and immediately opened my encrypted laptop. I needed to finalize the ultimate counter-invoice. I tallied the compound interest, adjusting the punitive damages to reflect the newly filed ethics grievance. The document was flawless, a lethal trap disguised as a simple spreadsheet. I sat back, reviewing the digital file. The defensive phase was over. The trap was set. I just needed to walk into the Friday meeting and let them pull the trigger. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was suddenly broken by the sharp ringing of my personal cell phone. I looked at the illuminated screen resting on the oak table. The caller identification displayed Harrison. My brother was calling. The timing was impeccable. The corporate suspension had undoubtedly been communicated back to the family. Harrison was calling to gloat. He was calling to deliver the final psychological blow, intending to break my spirit before the Friday showdown. I stared at his name flashing on the digital display, my pulse steadying into a calm, rhythmic beat. The next phase of the war was demanding my attention, and I was fully prepared to let my brother dig his own grave using nothing but his own arrogant voice. The device buzzed against the solid oak surface of my dining table. The caller identification displayed my brother's name in stark white lettering, Harrison. I stared at the illuminated screen, listening to the rhythmic vibration. The timing of his call was a textbook display of predatory instinct. The corporate suspension notice had just severed my professional lifeline, and news travels fast among the country club elite. He wanted to strike while I was bleeding. He wanted to hear the devastation in my voice. I did not answer immediately. Let him wait. Let the anticipation stretch his already frayed nerves. Harrison was a man who required constant validation. Growing up, he was the golden child, a prep school athlete who coasted on inherited prestige. When his grades faltered, my father made a generous donation to the alumni fund. When he crashed his first sports car, the local police chief received a quiet envelope. Harrison never learned how to survive actual adversity because he never had to face the consequences of his own incompetence. Now, staring down the barrel of an offshore liquidity crisis, his fragile ego was cracking under the immense strain. He needed to feel powerful, and tearing me down was his only available outlet. I tapped the face of my smartwatch. The digital interface shifted, bringing up a discrete audio recording application I installed for capturing complex forensic audit interviews. I swiped the activation toggle. A subtle haptic pulse against my wrist confirmed the microphone was live and capturing high-fidelity sound. Florida operates under a two-party consent law for recorded conversations in private spaces, but the statute contains a specific exemption. If the communication involves the commission of extortion or an act of financial fraud, the recording is fully admissible in a court of law. I took a deep breath, dropping my shoulders to alter the physical resonance of my vocal cords. I needed to sound small. I needed to sound broken. I swiped the green icon on my phone and brought the speaker to my ear. "Hello," I whispered. My voice carried a calculated tremor. A harsh, sharp laugh echoed through the receiver. Harrison sounded breathless, a toxic mixture of cruelty and raw panic. He was pacing. I could hear the faint sound of his leather loafers striking a hardwood floor. "You sound tired," little sister Harrison sneered. The arrogance in his tone was thick, but the rapid cadence of his speech betrayed his underlying terror. "I warned you not to play games with us. Did you enjoy your morning commute? I hear Human Resources escorted you out of the building like a common thief." I closed my eyes, picturing his smug expression. I wrapped my free hand around my stomach, curling inward, allowing the physical posture of defeat to shape my delivery. "Why did he do it, Harrison?" I pleaded, letting a synthetic sob catch in my throat. "Why did Dad file that complaint? He knows it is a lie. They took my corporate badge. My managing partner placed me on indefinite suspension. My entire career is ruined." "That is the point, Amalinda," he snapped. His patience was non-existent. He wanted total surrender, and he wanted it immediately. "You thought you could sit in your little high-rise and judge us? You thought you could just walk away from this family when we needed you the most? Dad had to teach you a lesson in loyalty." I pressed the phone closer to my ear. The trap was open. I just needed to coax him into stepping inside. I needed him to connect the ethics grievance directly to the stolen inheritance, establishing the legal parameters for extortion. "I do not understand what you want from me," I cried softly. "I do not have $230,000 sitting in a checking account. Even if I wanted to pay the invoice, I cannot give you cash I do not possess. Please tell him to drop the grievance. I will do whatever you need. Just tell him to stop." Harrison exhaled a sharp breath, his frustration boiling over. The fragile veneer of the sophisticated investment banker vanished, leaving only a desperate, cornered thief. He forgot he was speaking on an unsecured cellular line. He forgot I was a trained forensic auditor. His hubris blinded him to the basic rules of survival. "We do not want your cash, you stupid girl," Harrison spat, his voice echoing in the receiver. "We need your signature. The auditors are going to look at grandmother's trust. You think we do not know what happens when a ghost trust matures? If you do not sign that release, they will see the vault is empty." I kept my silence, letting the empty space draw him further into the snare. "You sign the release tomorrow at the house Amalinda Harrison commanded, delivering the exact phrasing I needed. You walk in, you sit down, and you sign the paper in front of the notary, or your license is ashes. Dad will push the elder abuse narrative until the state board strips your credentials forever. We spent that trust to keep this family afloat, and you owe us. You are going to fix the ledger." The haptic motor on my wrist pulsed a steady rhythm, confirming every single syllable was captured and encoded onto the digital drive. He said the quiet part out loud. He verified the mechanics of the embezzlement, acknowledging the ghost trust was empty because they spent it. He explicitly linked the fabricated ethics grievance to his demand for my signature, fulfilling the statutory definition of criminal extortion. It was a flawless, legally admissible confession. "I will be there," I whispered, maintaining the illusion of total defeat. "I will be at the Boca Raton house tomorrow afternoon. Just promise me he will retract the complaint after I sign. Be there at 3 o'clock sharp," Harrison ordered. "Do not make us wait." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear and tapped the screen of my smartwatch. The recording application terminated, saving the audio file to the encrypted local storage. I immediately initiated a secure transfer protocol, uploading the digital confession to an external cloud server located outside the jurisdiction of my corporate network. The progress bar filled with a satisfying green hue. The tension that had gripped my chest since the birthday dinner suddenly evaporated. I exhaled a long, shuddering breath, leaning back against the oak chair. The heavy weight of uncertainty vanished. I possessed the murder weapon. I held the smoking gun in the palm of my hand. The digital file was the final piece of the puzzle, the undeniable proof that would shatter their defense and send both my father and my brother to a federal penitentiary. I stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, painting the water in brilliant shades of copper and gold. I felt a profound sense of operational calm. The legal architecture of their trap was dismantled. The defensive phase was truly over. But as I watched a distant yacht slice through the dark water, a new, chilling realization began to form in the back of my mind. The operational calm shattered, replaced by a sharp spike of adrenaline. I possessed the proof, but the digital file alone was not enough to trigger the trap. Sending the recording to the authorities from the safety of my apartment would only initiate a slow, bureaucratic investigation. Richard and Harrison would use that time to shred their physical documents, liquidate their remaining assets, and flee to their Bahamian sanctuary. They would slip through the cracks of the justice system. To execute the financial guillotine I had constructed, I had to deliver the counter-invoice in person. I had to force Richard to commit perjury in front of the state-appointed notary. I had to watch him realize the game was over, pinning him to the table before he could run. That meant I had to walk into the Boca Raton estate tomorrow at 3 o'clock. The sprawling Mediterranean mansion was their stronghold. It was a fortress of wrought iron gates and high-security walls. Richard controlled the environment. He controlled the guest list. Tomorrow, that house would be filled with desperate people facing the total destruction of their lives. My father, my brother, my mother, all backed into a corner, fully aware that Friday was their final deadline before the shadow lenders seized their world. When I slid that $1 million invoice across the mahogany dining table and revealed the depths of my counterstrike, the polite illusions would instantly burn away. I would be trapped inside a locked house with apex predators who just realized they were the prey. They would not surrender gracefully. They would react with the raw, unpredictable fury of caged animals. The ticking clock echoed in my ears. I had less than 24 hours to prepare. I had secured the legal weapon, but surviving the physical execution of the trap was an entirely different war. I turned away from the window, my eyes fixed on the heavy red folder resting on the dining table, wondering if I was walking into a reckoning or a slaughter. The sun dipped below the Miami skyline, casting long shadows that swallowed the fading copper light across Biscayne Bay. Inside my apartment, the atmosphere shifted from operational calm to a relentless, driving focus. The recorded confession from my brother secured the criminal element of their conspiracy. That audio file guaranteed Richard and Harrison would face federal prosecutors. Sending them to a penitentiary was a necessary component of justice, but it felt insufficient. A prison sentence punished the crime, yet it did not restore the stolen capital. It did not repair the systemic damage they inflicted. I needed a mechanism for financial retrieval. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling windows and returned to the oak dining table. I opened the digitized probate folio containing my grandmother's estate records. Josephine Sterling was not a woman who left details to chance. She constructed a logistics empire during an era when corporate boardrooms were uniquely hostile to female executives. She survived by anticipating the betrayals of desperate men. She knew her son-in-law possessed the moral flexibility of a starving predator. If she suspected Richard might attempt to bypass the independent trustee and access the ghost trust, she would have engineered a countermeasure. I began a meticulous line-by-line review of the original trust charter. The document spanned 80 pages of dense, archaic legal typography. I read through the standard clauses detailing the initial principal, the designated municipal bond investments, and the specific maturation date tied to my 25th birthday. I scanned the fiduciary obligations and the tax deferment schedules. The text was dry, designed to exhaust a casual reader. Hours slipped past. The digital clock on my monitor displayed 2 a.m. My eyes burned, but I refused to step away. I reached page 64. Hidden beneath a labyrinth of subclauses regarding trustee succession, I found a section titled Remedies for Fiduciary Breach. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my heart rate accelerating with each word I absorbed. Josephine had embedded a fail-safe clause deep within the legal architecture of the trust. The phrasing was brilliant, terrifying, and razor-sharp. The mandate stated that if the guarantor, designated explicitly as Richard Brown, misappropriated the funds or violated his fiduciary duty to the primary beneficiary, a specific punitive protocol activated. The clause granted the beneficiary the immediate legal right to execute a superior lien against the guarantor's physical holdings. I read the paragraph 3 times to ensure I was interpreting the legal terminology correctly. It was a right of immediate attachment. Josephine essentially wrote a dormant foreclosure order into my inheritance. She codified her warning into law. If Richard stole my future, the charter granted me the unilateral authority to seize his present. The strategic implications rippled through my mind, reshaping the entire battlefield. Richard had secretly leveraged the Boca Raton estate to secure a mezzanine loan from unregulated shadow lenders. He fed that borrowed capital into the Bahamian cryptocurrency syndicate. Those offshore creditors were currently circling the property, preparing to execute their pre-foreclosure notice. They believed their claim held priority. They were wrong. My grandmother's trust predated Richard's shadow loan by over a decade. In the realm of property law, the hierarchy of claims is dictated by chronology. A prior recorded claim supersedes a subsequent debt. Because Richard stole from a legally vested trust to fund his initial offshore investments, my right of attachment ranked highest on the title chain. I did not just possess the power to send my father to a federal penitentiary. I possessed the absolute legal authority to claim the deed to his house. I could evict the shadow lenders, terminate the offshore liens, and seize the sprawling Mediterranean mansion for myself. The sanctuary my parents fought so ruthlessly to protect, the fortress they planned to use as a staging ground for my humiliation tomorrow, was legally mine for the taking. The ultimate payoff materialized in front of me. I opened a blank spreadsheet on my laptop. It was time to draft the counterstrike. I was going to construct an invoice that would strip them of everything they owned. I started with the stolen principal, $230,000. I keyed the number into the first row. Next, I calculated the lost yield. My grandmother directed the trustee to invest the capital in conservative, high-yield municipal bonds. By liquidating the account prematurely, Richard robbed me of a decade of market growth. I applied a standard 7% annual compound interest formula to the principal over the duration of the theft. The secondary figure populated the cell, adding $250,000 to the ledger. I moved to the third row, punitive damages. My father had filed a fabricated grievance with the State Ethical Oversight Board, maliciously accusing me of financial elder abuse to paralyze my career. Defamation of a certified public accountant carries immense civil liability. I calculated a modest estimate of potential lost future earnings and reputational damage. I added $500,000 to the running total. Finally, I factored in the operational cost of unraveling their conspiracy. I was a senior corporate auditor. My firm billed my specialized forensic services at a premium rate. I reviewed the internal time-tracking software on my phone, noting the hours I spent hacking the probate archives, tracing the Bahamian corporate registries, and decrypting my brother's network traffic logs. I billed my own family at my standard corporate rate of $800 an hour. I highlighted the column and clicked the summation icon. The spreadsheet calculated the final demand, $1,400,000. It was a staggering, irrefutable figure. The math was verifiable. The legal precedent was backed by the original trust charter. The criminal foundation was supported by Harrison's recorded confession and the forged wire transfer documents. I formatted the spreadsheet into a formal corporate demand letter. I attached the supporting exhibits, creating a comprehensive dossier of their systemic fraud. I routed the file to my secure laser printer. The machine whirred to life in the corner of the dining room. I listened to the rhythmic hum as the pages fed through the tray, the smell of hot toner filling the cool air of the apartment. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, aligning the edges, with precise taps against the oak table. I slid the thick stack of evidence into a heavy crimson portfolio. The red-tabbed folder felt substantial in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of my vengeance, engineered to dismantle their empire in a matter of seconds. I set the crimson portfolio next to my car keys. The preparation phase concluded. The weapon was fully assembled and loaded. However, a critical logistical hurdle remained. A piece of paper, regardless of its legal validity, requires institutional enforcement to execute a property seizure in real time. If I simply slid this invoice across the mahogany dining table tomorrow afternoon, Richard would deny its authority. He would attempt to shred the documents. He would stall using the weekend to flee the jurisdiction before I could file the attachment order with a county judge. To execute the trap seamlessly, I needed to bypass the standard judicial delays. I needed an inside ally. I required a fiduciary officer wielding federal authority, someone who possessed the power to freeze the estate the exact second Richard committed perjury in front of the notary public. I looked at the digital clock. It was 4 a.m. on Friday. The sun would rise soon, bringing the deadline with it. I opened my encrypted contact database, searching for a specific name I had uncovered during my deep dive into the probate archives. It was the veteran trust officer who originally managed my grandmother's estate before Richard bypassed him with the forged paperwork. I needed to convince a rigid, compliance-obsessed stranger to join my war council, and I had only a few hours to secure his allegiance before I drove into the Boca Raton stronghold. The digital clock on my monitor shifted to 4:30 in the morning. The sky outside the high-rise windows remained a profound, impenetrable black. I had exactly 10 hours before the scheduled confrontation at the Boca Raton estate. The legal blueprint for my counterstrike was flawless, but a printed spreadsheet possessed zero enforcement power on its own. I needed a sword to back up the math. I needed federal authority. I pulled up the contact profile for William Sterling. He was the veteran independent trust officer who managed the peripheral accounts of my grandmother's estate. He was a man constructed entirely of rigid protocols and ledger lines. During the rare occasions he attended family functions in my youth, he wore pristine three-piece suits despite the suffocating Florida humidity. He possessed a legendary reputation in the Miami financial sector for his ruthless adherence to statutory compliance. He despised my father. I routed a secure encrypted line through my corporate virtual private network. I dialed his direct cellular number, bypassing his office switchboard. The line rang twice. A voice answered, sharp awake and entirely devoid of morning grogginess. "William Sterling here." "Mr. Sterling, this is Amalinda Brown, Josephine Sterling's granddaughter." A brief silence hung on the connection. The subtle static of the encrypted channel hummed in my ear. "I am aware of who you are, Ms. Brown," Sterling replied. His tone was measured, betraying no surprise. "It is 4:30 in the morning. I apologize for the unannounced intrusion," I said, keeping my vocal delivery clinical and stripped of all emotional resonance. "I am currently transmitting a secure data packet to your personal encrypted terminal. The access password is my grandmother's date of birth. I suggest you open it immediately." I heard the faint clicking of a mechanical keyboard through the receiver. "What exactly am I looking at?" Sterling asked. "You are looking at a multi-jurisdictional financial crime executed under your fiduciary umbrella," I stated. The clicking ceased. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the speaker. I watched the progress bar on my monitor turn green, confirming the successful delivery of the digital dossier. Inside that folder, you will find the original mandate for the generation-skipping ghost trust established by Josephine I, explained. You will also find a digitized withdrawal requisition dated 3 years ago. The requisition liquidated the municipal bonds and transferred the liquid capital to a Bahamian holding company named RBH International. I waited as Sterling opened the attached files. The silence stretched for a full minute. He was a professional auditor. He did not need me to hold his hand through the evidence. He saw the timeline. He recognized the offshore routing data. This signature is a crude forgery. Sterling finally spoke. His voice dropped an octave. The composure remained, but a cold, hard fury radiated beneath his words. He bypassed the dual authentication mandate by fabricating a verified letter of consent. He utilized a compromised local notary to stamp the initial transfer. He drained the vault. I opened the final audio file I instructed. It is a recording of a cellular conversation that occurred yesterday afternoon. I remained quiet while Sterling listened to Harrison's frantic voice. My brother's recorded words filled the veteran trust officer's quiet office. Harrison explicitly detailed the extortion, linking the fabricated ethics grievance directly to their demand for my signature. He confessed to spending the trust to keep the family afloat. When the audio playback concluded, Sterling exhaled a long, steady breath. They are demanding you legitimize the theft today at 3 o'clock. They want you to sign a retroactive waiver of claims to shield them from the automatic federal audit. Yes, I confirmed. My father secretly leveraged the Boca Raton estate with unregulated shadow lenders to fund his offshore cryptocurrency investments. The market collapsed. The shadow lenders are executing a pre-foreclosure notice this weekend. If I do not sign that promissory note today, my father will face a federal indictment for embezzlement and he will lose the mansion. And if you do sign it, you become an accessory to wire fraud, Sterling noted, anticipating the trap. I have no intention of signing his document, I said. I intend to invoke the dormant fail-safe clause my grandmother embedded in the original charter, the provision regarding the remedies for fiduciary breach. Another pause stretched across the secure line. I could hear the rustle of heavy paper as Sterling reviewed the specific subclause. You intend to execute a superior lien against his physical holdings, Sterling realized. The brilliance of the strategy resonated in his voice. It is a bold maneuver, Ms. Brown. If executed correctly, your right of attachment supersedes all existing creditor claims because the trust predates his mezzanine loan. It only works if we trap him during the commission of a new, verifiable fraud, I countered. If I confront him right now, he will stall. He will shred his physical records, deny the audio recording, and flee the jurisdiction to Nassau. I need him trapped in a closed room, attempting to finalize the cover-up in front of a state-appointed official. What do you require from me? Sterling asked. I need an emergency ex parte injunction, I instructed. I need your internal legal counsel to draft the property seizure order and place it in the electronic filing queue of the federal district court. But you cannot submit it until I give the signal. We must synchronize. The strike, Sterling agreed, the cadence of his speech quickening with operational efficiency. The execution must occur precisely when the perjury is verbalized. I will wear an open microphone, I explained. I will establish a continuous, secure audio feed from my smartwatch directly to your terminal. When my father presents the fraudulent document, I will ask him a specific, granular question regarding the destination of the stolen funds. He will be forced to lie out loud in front of the notary to maintain his illusion. And the moment he commits perjury, on the record, the trap snaps shut, Sterling said. What is the designated signal? When I say the words, my audit found several critical discrepancies, you hit submit on the federal portal I commanded. The injunction will become active within seconds, Sterling confirmed. The Boca Raton estate will be legally frozen under a federal hold. He will not be able to borrow against it, sell it, or use it as collateral to escape. I will have my senior litigation team standing by the terminal. We will be ready at 3 o'clock. I ended the call. The heavy, dark weight of isolation lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer fighting a solitary war against a corrupted family hierarchy. I possessed a powerful institutional ally. The legal machinery was primed, waiting for my command to drop the blade. The sun breached the horizon, flooding Biscayne Bay with brilliant, blinding light. The sky transitioned from ink black to a vibrant, bruised purple, then finally into a clear, unforgiving blue. It was time to move. I walked into my bedroom and selected my armor. I chose a tailored charcoal blazer and matching trousers. The fabric was immaculate, projecting an aura of untouchable corporate authority. I pulled my hair back into a severe, polished knot. I applied minimal makeup. I did not want to look like a daughter attending a family gathering. I wanted to look like an executioner attending a liquidation. I returned to the dining room table. The crimson portfolio rested next to my laptop. The thick stack of printed evidence inside the red folder felt dense and heavy. The forged withdrawal slips, the Bahamian corporate registry screenshots, the fail-safe clause, and the final demand letter invoicing them for $1.4 million. I slid the crimson portfolio into my leather briefcase. I grabbed my car keys from the glass bowl near the front door. I rode the elevator down to the subterranean parking garage. The concrete walls echoed with the sound of my sensible heels. I climbed into the driver's seat of my sedan and started the engine. The dashboard clock displayed 1 in the afternoon. The drive to Palm Beach County would take an hour. I wanted to arrive early. I wanted to force them to sit in the suffocating tension of their own making. I navigated my vehicle out of the dark garage and merged onto Interstate 95 heading north. The Florida sun beat down on the asphalt, creating shimmering heat waves in the distance. The air conditioning in my cabin blew ice cold against my face. The urban density of Miami gradually gave way to the sprawling, manicured wealth of Boca Raton. The landscape shifted to pristine golf courses, towering palm trees, and imposing wrought iron gates. This was a world built on illusions, where men like my father traded phantom equity for social prestige. I, gripping the steering wheel, feeling the steady thrum of the tires against the highway, I was driving straight into the heart of their fortress. The ticking clock in my mind grew louder with every passing mile, echoing the inevitable impending collision. The iron gates of the Boca Raton estate parted with a smooth, mechanical hum. My tires rolled onto the crushed white shell driveway, the sound sharp and distinct in the quiet afternoon air. The Mediterranean architecture loomed ahead, an imposing monument to a legacy built entirely on sand. The grand fountain in the circular courtyard sprayed pristine arcs of water into the blinding Florida sun. To a casual observer traversing the exclusive neighborhood, this property represented a fortress of untouchable generational prosperity. To my trained forensic eyes, it was a crime scene waiting for the yellow tape. I parked my sedan near the grand entrance, shifting the transmission into park. I left the engine running for a brief moment, centering my focus. I reached into the passenger seat and retrieved my leather briefcase. I opened the brass clasp and extracted the crimson portfolio. The thick stack of printed evidence felt dense and heavy against my ribs as I tucked the red folder under my arm. I stepped out of the vehicle and into the stifling subtropical heat. Before I climbed the wide stone steps leading to the front door, I tapped the screen of my smartwatch. The discreet audio application engaged. A subtle haptic pulse against my wrist confirmed the encrypted transmission was live. Miles away in his downtown office, Mr. Sterling and his senior litigation team were now listening to a real-time feed of my surroundings. The federal injunction was cued on their terminal. The institutional trap was armed. I bypassed the heavy brass knocker and turned the handle of the custom oak door. The entryway was unlocked. My parents had likely dismissed the household staff for the day to ensure total privacy for their extortion scheme. Or perhaps the rolling offshore debts meant they could no longer afford the domestic payroll. I stepped across the threshold. The transition from the sweltering outdoor heat to the interior climate was jarring. The central air conditioning was programmed to a frigid 68 degrees. The sudden chill bit through the tailored fabric of my charcoal blazer. The ambient temperature was a physical manifestation of their underlying panic. They were sweating through their expensive designer clothes, requiring the freezing air to maintain their composed, aristocratic facades. A sharp, overwhelming scent flooded my senses the moment I closed the door. Someone had lit a dozen expensive citrus candles, placing the burning wicks on various credenzas and marble console tables throughout the grand foyer. The bright, artificial lemon fragrance was thick and cloying. It was a desperate olfactory attempt to mask the undeniable stench of their impending ruin. I walked down the long corridor leading to the formal dining room. My sensible heels clicked a steady, unhurried rhythm against the imported marble tiles. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, announcing my arrival like a ticking metronome. I passed oil portraits of distant ancestors, silent witnesses to the collapse of their lineage. I entered the dining room. The staging was immaculate, designed to project authority and demand my immediate submission. My father Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He wore a pristine navy suit and a silk tie, but the garments seemed to hang loosely off his frame. The skin around his eyes looked bruised, shadowed by sleepless nights and the relentless pressure of his offshore creditors. He projected the posture of a king holding court, but his kingdom was in active foreclosure. My mother Patricia sat to his immediate right. She wore a tailored beige dress, her hair sprayed into a rigid golden helmet. Her posture was razor straight, a physical rejection of the collapse occurring all around her. She clutched a crystal water goblet, her knuckles white with tension. Harrison occupied the far side of the room. My brother could not sit still. He paced the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows, his leather loafers scuffing against the expensive Persian rug. He radiated a frantic, unspooling energy. The offshore margin calls were due by the close of business today. He was a man watching the final grains of sand slip through an hourglass, knowing a federal indictment waited at the bottom. Victoria stood near the arched doorway leading to the kitchen. My sister-in-law kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale and drawn. She offered no greeting. She simply stared at me with wide, frightened eyes, a passenger trapped on a sinking ship. Nobody spoke as I approached the empty chair positioned directly opposite my father. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken threats and calculated desperation. I placed my leather clutch and the crimson portfolio onto the floor near my feet. I pulled back the heavy wooden chair and sat down. I kept my spine straight, resting my hands lightly on the polished mahogany surface. I offered a blank, unreadable expression. I was a blank slate, a mirror reflecting nothing but their own terror back at them. In the exact center of the table, perfectly aligned between my father and me, sat the snare. It was the promissory note and release of claims. The heavy, watermarked paper rested on a dark leather writing pad. Next to the document lay the gold Mont Blanc pen. The polished metal caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. It was the weapon they wanted me to use against myself. The quiet stretched. In standard social interactions, human beings possess a psychological compulsion to fill empty space with words. In forensic interrogations, silence is the most effective tool in the arsenal. You let the target sit in the void. You let their anxiety compound until the internal pressure forces them to make a mistake. I did not reach for the paper. I simply looked at it. Patricia cracked first. She leaned forward, forcing a tight, brittle smile that exposed her teeth without reaching her eyes. "We are so glad you came, Amalinda," my mother said. Her voice carried a high, synthetic pitch that vibrated with false warmth. "Your father and I appreciate you handling this family bookkeeping matter today. We know you understand the importance of unity right now." I turned my gaze toward her. I did not nod. I did not return the smile. I offered a slow, deliberate blink. Her manufactured empathy withered under my cold stare. Patricia swallowed hard, her hand dropping to her lap where her fingers knotted together in a white-knuckled grip. Richard cleared his throat. The sound was harsh, an attempt to reassert his patriarchal dominance over the room. He reached out and tapped his gold signet ring against the mahogany wood. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet space. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," my father instructed. His tone was clipped and authoritative, though a faint tremor betrayed his underlying fear. "You read the document at dinner. You understand the terms. It is a standard release acknowledging the financial support we provided during your upbringing. I require your signature on the dotted line." I shifted my attention back to him. I extended my right arm, moving with agonizing slowness. I picked up the promissory note. I held the heavy paper in both hands, bringing it closer to my face. I did not pick up the gold pen. I began to read the text. I did not skim the paragraphs. I read every single printed word, tracing the sentences with my eyes at a deliberate, glacial pace. The psychological pressure in the room spiked. Every second I delayed was a physical blow to their frayed nerves. Harrison stopped pacing. He stood frozen by the window, his chest heaving as he watched me scrutinize the document. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the adjacent hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. I reached the second paragraph. I paused, tilting my head slightly as if encountering a confusing clause. I reread the section. The air conditioning hummed, blowing frigid air across the back of my neck. Richard shifted his weight in his chair. The leather creaked beneath him. He tapped his signet ring against the table a second time. The rhythm was faster now, stripped of its previous authority, replaced by raw impatience. "It is a straightforward release," Amalinda Richard pressed. "There is no need for a forensic review. We have a notary public waiting on standby in the home office. I just need you to execute the document so we can finalize the ledger before the weekend." I ignored his instruction. I turned the page over, examining the blank reverse side, dragging the silent torture out for another painful 30 seconds. I was training them. I was establishing the new power dynamic. They believed they were the predators, forcing a cornered victim into submission. I needed them to feel the agonizing realization that I controlled the pace of this execution. Harrison let out a sharp, ragged breath. He took 2 steps toward the table, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. His face was flushed, the veins standing out on his neck. The sophisticated investment banker was gone, replaced by a desperate thief watching his escape route narrow. I placed the promissory note back onto the leather writing pad. I smoothed the edges of the paper, aligning it perfectly with the gold Mont Blanc pen. I folded my hands together and rested them on the edge of the mahogany table. I looked directly into my father's eyes. The trap was primed. The audience was captive. The secure audio feed was transmitting every breath to the federal trust officer waiting in the shadows. The agonizing silence had broken their defenses, leaving them exposed and reactive. It was time to dissect their perjury out loud. Harrison could not endure the quiet a single second longer. The invisible weight pressing down on the dining room finally fractured his fragile composure. He lunged forward, his hands slammed flat against the polished mahogany surface. The crystal water goblets rattled from the impact, spilling drops of condensation onto the pristine wood. "Just sign the damn paper, Amalinda," Harrison shouted. His voice cracked. The sophisticated facade of the successful investment banker disintegrated, leaving behind a terrified child throwing a tantrum. "The offshore deadline is in 2 hours. Stop playing your little forensic auditor games and put your name on the dotted line right now." I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly aligned. I looked up at my brother. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, soaking into the collar of his expensive custom shirt. Fear radiated from him in palpable waves, mingling with the sickening citrus scent of the burning candles. He was unraveling right in front of me, stripped of all the unearned confidence our father had purchased for him. "Harrison," my father snapped. Richard raised a hand, attempting to restore order to his crumbling kingdom. "Control yourself. You are acting like a fool." Richard turned his gaze back to me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely stripped of all paternal affection. He reached into his suit jacket and retrieved his phone. He pressed a single button. "Send her in," Richard instructed the person on the other end. He placed the device face down on the table. "We are finished waiting, Amalinda. The time for reviewing standard boilerplate language has expired. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the dining room clicked open. A woman stepped into the tense atmosphere. She wore a modest gray skirt suit and carried a thick, leather-bound ledger under her arm. A silver embossed seal hung from a lanyard around her neck. She was the mobile notary public Richard had hired to authenticate his cover-up. She looked nervous, clearly sensing the toxic undercurrent flooding the room. But she approached the table with professional detachment. The notary set her ledger down next to the gold Mont Blanc pen. She unzipped a small pouch and withdrew her official state stamping device. "Good afternoon," the notary said. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. "I need to verify the identities of all signing parties, and I need verbal confirmation that this document is being executed free of duress." My mother, Patricia, immediately leaned forward. "Of course it is," she insisted. Her synthetic smile returned, forced and desperate. "We are just handling some routine family estate planning. Nothing to worry about. It is a gift of financial clarity for our daughter." I glanced at my wrist. The subtle haptic pulse of my smartwatch continued its steady, rhythmic beat against my skin. The encrypted audio feed was streaming every spoken syllable directly to William Sterling and his federal litigation team in downtown Miami. The stage was set. The state official was present. The federal net was waiting. I picked up the heavy, watermarked paper one more time. I held it steady in the frigid air of the dining room. I did not reach for the gold pen. I looked directly into my father's eyes, locking onto his gaze. "I have a question regarding paragraph 4, I said. My voice was even, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. Richard clenched his jaw, a muscle feathered in his cheek. "Ask your question and sign the release," he commanded. "We have wasted enough time today." I utilized my forensic skills aloud, dissecting the legal phrasing piece by piece for the benefit of the hidden recording device. "This document states the $230,000 was dispersed to my accounts for educational and historical living expenses. The clause claims the ledger is settled in full." "That is correct," Richard affirmed. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest in a defensive posture. "It is an accurate historical accounting of our investment in your future." I lowered the paper. I shifted my gaze to the notary, ensuring she was paying close attention, before locking eyes with my father again. The trap was wide open. I just needed him to step onto the trigger. "For the notary's record, Dad," I asked, "which specific account did you wire those funds to?" The air in the room vanished. The question was a scalpel cutting straight through the vague legal boilerplate and demanding a granular, verifiable fact. In the world of corporate auditing, generalities are worthless. Specific routing numbers are the only currency that matters. Richard froze. He could not tell the truth. He could not admit he funneled the capital into a Bahamian cryptocurrency syndicate named RBH International Holdings. He could not invoke the ghost trust without admitting to the initial theft. He needed to invent a lie on the spot to appease the notary and maintain the illusion of a legitimate family debt. He needed to name a specific domestic destination for the money. Patricia stopped breathing. Harrison stood paralyzed by the window, realizing the danger of the question, but powerless to intervene without alerting the state official to their fraud. Richard calculated his response. He was a man accustomed to talking his way out of tight corners. He assumed a confident posture, uncrossing his arms and placing his hands flat on the mahogany table. "We wired the funds into the joint collegiate checking account we opened for you when you attended the university," Richard lied. His delivery was smooth, practiced, and entirely fabricated. It was the primary account at the regional bank downtown. We transferred the capital in monthly installments to cover your tuition, housing, and personal expenses over the course of 4 years. The account was closed after your graduation. The mobile notary nodded, satisfied with the specific explanation. She opened her ledger, preparing to log the details of the transaction and stamp the paper. The trap slammed shut. Richard Brown just committed verifiable perjury. He stated a material lie out loud in front of a state-appointed official while attempting to secure a signature on a financial contract. The collegiate checking account he referenced had a historical maximum balance of $5,000. The archived bank records would prove his claim was mathematically impossible. He just provided the exact legal ammunition I needed to void the document and trigger the federal injunction. I held the promissory note in my hands for one final second. Then I let it fall. The heavy paper drifted down, landing flat against the dark leather writing pad. It remained blank. I reached out and picked up the gold Mont Blanc pen. I felt the cool, polished metal between my fingers. Harrison let out a heavy breath of relief, assuming I was finally surrendering to their demands. Patricia relaxed her rigid posture, her shoulders dropping. Richard offered a smug, victorious smile, believing he had outsmarted me one last time. I set the gold pen down on the opposite side of the table, pushing it far out of my reach. "I reviewed your invoice," I said. My voice rang like a bell through the silent dining room, clear and uncompromising. This was the designated signal. Miles away in his secure office, William Sterling would hear those exact words through his encrypted terminal. He would immediately instruct his legal team to press the submit button on the federal portal. The Boca Raton estate was now legally frozen. The shadow lenders could not touch it. My father could not leverage it. But my audit found several critical discrepancies, I continued. The smug smile vanished from my father's face. Harrison lunged back toward the table, his panic returning tenfold. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Sign the paper, Amalinda." I reached down and unclasped the brass lock on my leather briefcase. I pulled out the thick, crimson portfolio. The red-tabbed folder gleamed under the light of the crystal chandelier. I placed my hand flat against the heavy cover, feeling the weight of the evidence inside. The forged withdrawal slips, the offshore holding documents, the fail-safe clause from my grandmother's ghost trust, and the final counter-invoice totaling $1.4 million. "I am not signing anything," I stated. "I am delivering my findings." I pushed the crimson portfolio forward. The heavy folder slid across the polished mahogany wood, stopping directly in front of my father. The sound of the sliding cardboard echoed in the cavernous room like a final gavel strike. The defensive phase was officially over. The financial guillotine had dropped. Richard stared at the red folder as if it were a live explosive, his face drained of color. The artificial citrus scent in the air could no longer mask the raw, suffocating reality of the moment. The illusions were dead. The consequences had arrived. Richard reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the crimson portfolio across the mahogany surface. He flipped the heavy cover open. The first document resting on top of the stack was the itemized counter invoice, $1,400,000. His eyes scanned the crisp black text, tracking the arithmetic of his own ruin. The columns detailed the original stolen principal of $230,000. The next row outlined a decade of lost yield, calculated at a standard 7% compound interest rate. Below that sat the punitive damages for defamation, alongside the itemized billing hours for my corporate forensic audit. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He stopped breathing. The air simply backed up in his throat, choking him. He turned the page with stiff, uncoordinated fingers. He stared at the digital screenshots from the Bahamian corporate registry, displaying the officers of RBH International Holdings. He saw the offshore routing numbers. He saw the forged withdrawal slip from Josephine Sterling's ghost trust, bearing the crude imitation of my signature. Finally, his eyes landed on the highlighted text of the fail-safe clause, granting me the immediate right of attachment to his physical holdings. The architecture of his destruction was printed in undeniable black and white. Harrison could not tolerate the suffocating suspense a single second longer. He leaned over his father's shoulder and snatched the papers from Richard's slack grip. The heavy pages rustled loudly in the silent room. Harrison's eyes darted across the text. He saw the encrypted network traffic logs. He saw his own digital footprint, his specific IP address mapped directly to the offshore cryptocurrency syndicate transfers. The illusion of the sophisticated, untouchable investment broker evaporated instantly. His arrogant sneer collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He let out a choked, guttural sound, his chest heaving as he realized the federal implications of the documents in his hands. Patricia realized the silence was not a negotiation tactic. It was a funeral dirge. She stood up, her beige tailored dress wrinkling as she leaned over the table. She looked at the final tally on the invoice clutched in her son's shaking hands. The staggering dollar amount registered in her mind, shattering the fragile veneer of maternal concern and aristocratic grace. She let out a high-pitched wail. It was a primal, piercing sound that cut through the frigid air conditioning of the dining room. The family unit splintered instantly, driven by raw self-preservation. Patricia turned on Harrison. "It was your idea," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "You told us the digital markets were a guaranteed return. You promised we would double the trust before she turned 25. She shoved her son backward, sacrificing her golden child without a second of hesitation, to distance herself from the impending criminal fallout. Harrison stumbled his designer loafers, slipping on the Persian rug, stammering incoherent denials. I watched the implosion from my seat at the end of the table, keeping my posture perfectly still. In the periphery of my vision, a subtle movement caught my attention. Victoria stood by the arched doorway leading to the kitchen. She observed the screaming match between her husband and her mother-in-law. She performed a swift, cold calculation. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply reached down, picked up her counterfeit black leather handbag, turned on her heel, and walked out of the room. I heard the heavy front door open and click shut. The ultimate abandonment. Victoria vanished, fleeing the sinking ship before the authorities arrived. The mobile notary public standing near the table scrambled backward. Her face was pale, drained of all color. She realized she had nearly affixed her official state seal to a federal crime. She shoved her ledger into her bag, zipped her pouch with trembling hands, and practically ran down the corridor toward the exit, desperate to escape the blast radius of the Brown family collapse. Richard remained seated. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. He looked at me, a cornered predator, searching his empty arsenal for a final weapon. He raised a shaking hand, pointing a finger at my face. "The ethics board," he stammered, his voice weak but laced with venom. "You think a spreadsheet protects you. The State Oversight Committee will strip your accounting credentials. My grievance is already filed. You will never work in the financial sector again." I felt a genuine cold smile curve my lips. The moment of poetic justice had arrived. "That is the best part, Dad," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You misunderstood the corporate machinery you tried to manipulate." Richard stared at me, his jaw slack, the venom in his eyes faltering. "When you filed a formal accusation of financial elder abuse against a senior corporate auditor, you triggered a mandatory compliance protocol," I explained. "My firm did not just suspend me. They activated the anti-money laundering division. The compliance officers are legally required to run a deep, federal-level audit on the accuser to verify the claims before they investigate the employee." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He slumped back against the leather chair. "They spent the last 24 hours pulling your tax returns and subpoenaing your domestic accounts." I continued, my voice ringing clear and steady. "They already found the offshore wire transfers. They already submitted a suspicious activity report. The Federal Bureau of Investigation possesses your Bahamian files right now. You handed them the keys to your own syndicate." In the distance, beyond the manicured lawns and the wrought iron gates, a faint sound drifted through the heavy Florida heat. It was the rising, rhythmic wail of sirens. The pitch climbed higher and sharper, approaching fast. I reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved my phone. I terminated the encrypted audio stream to William Sterling. The federal trust officer had heard everything. The trap was sealed. "The fail-safe clause in grandmother's trust is active," I informed my father, my words cutting through the approaching sirens. Mr. Sterling submitted the emergency injunction to the federal portal the exact second you committed perjury regarding the collegiate checking account. Your assets are frozen. The shadow lenders cannot touch this estate, and neither can you. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and stood up. My lien holds chronological superiority, I stated. I am claiming the deed to this property to satisfy the stolen principal. You are officially evicted. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal blazer. The chaos in the room felt distant, separated by an invisible wall of impenetrable glass. Patricia was still sobbing near the window. Harrison was staring at the floor, paralyzed by the sound of the sirens echoing through the pristine neighborhood. Richard sat frozen, a broken man trapped inside a cage of his own design. I picked up my leather briefcase. I turned my back on the shattered remnants of the Brown family. I walked down the long marble corridor, my heels clicking a steady rhythm toward the exit. I stepped out through the heavy oak doors and into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the $1.4 million invoice resting perfectly in the center of the mahogany table. There is a quiet, unspoken contract signed the moment a child is brought into this world. In the complex fabric of American culture, traditional family structures have long been held as the ultimate safety net, a sanctuary of unconditional support, moral guidance, and foundational love. We are taught from a very young age that a family is a secure harbor, a place where we are valued for our inherent humanity rather than our utility. But what happens when the harbor is mined? What happens when the people entrusted with guiding us into the future instead view us as a resource to be exploited, leveraged, and ultimately discarded? When the pressure mounts, the story of Amelinda Brown is much more than a satisfying thriller of offshore bank accounts, forensic accounting, and high-stakes financial warfare. At its core, it is a profound, devastating exploration of parenting values and the catastrophic consequences of a family breakdown caused by deep betrayal. It strips away the polished, wealthy veneer of societal success to reveal the hollow rot that festers when honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness are ruthlessly sacrificed on the altar of status and survival. To truly understand the tragedy of the Brown family, we must look past the stolen $230,000. The theft of the grandmother's ghost trust was merely the physical symptom of a much deeper, systemic emotional disease. Richard and Patricia Brown failed as parents long before they forged their daughter's signature on a withdrawal slip. They failed the exact moment they began viewing their children not as human beings with independent futures and emotional needs, but as extensions of their own fragile egos and tools for their own financial salvation. In the hyper-competitive landscape of modern American society in 2026, where the intense pressure to project an image of limitless success can be absolutely suffocating, parents often lose sight of their true, fundamental responsibilities. Raising a child is not a transactional ledger. When Richard slid that heavily watermarked invoice across the white linen tablecloth at Prime 112, demanding reimbursement for childhood piano lessons, orthodontics, and basic groceries, he perverted the very essence of parental duty. A child does not ask to be born into this world, and the baseline requirements of care, food, shelter, education, and safety are not loans to be called in when the parents face a sudden liquidity crisis. True family responsibility means providing without the expectation of a financial return. It means establishing an environment where a child's security is a guaranteed foundation, not a collateral asset to be leveraged in times of desperation. Furthermore, the narrative serves as a stark, uncompromising warning about the destructive nature of parental favoritism and the erosion of fairness within the home. Look closely at Harrison, the family's designated golden child. He was raised with a silver spoon securely in his mouth, but he was entirely deprived of the fundamental character-building experiences of accountability and consequence. Richard and Patricia essentially bought his way out of every failure, subsidizing his corporate partnership and turning a blind eye to his incompetence. In doing so, they did not protect their son. They ruined him. They engineered an arrogant, deeply fragile man who crumbled into panic the moment he faced a crisis he could not easily buy his way out of. When Harrison paced the dining room screaming and demanding his sister sign away her future and her freedom to cover his offshore gambling losses, he was acting exactly as he had been programmed to act by his parents. A family structure simply cannot survive when the scales of fairness are so violently and permanently tipped. Such blatant discrimination breeds entitlement in the favored child and a cold, detached resentment in the scapegoat. Equally critical to this breakdown is the total absence of emotional awareness within the Brown household. Emotional awareness in parenting is the ability to recognize, validate, and nurture a child's inner world without a selfish agenda. It is the daily practice of building a relationship rooted in mutual respect and deep, abiding trust. Patricia attempted to weaponize maternal guilt, bringing a cheap grocery store cake and manufacturing tears to gaslight and manipulate Amalinda. She fundamentally misunderstood her own daughter because she had never taken the time to truly know her. She assumed Amalinda would be a compliant, naive victim because Patricia only saw what she desperately needed to see. Had Richard and Patricia fostered genuine emotional intelligence within their home, they would have recognized the formidable, fiercely independent woman they had raised. Instead, their emotional blindness led them straight into her meticulously laid trap. Long-term guidance for children requires significantly more than just funding their private school tuitions or securing their coveted places in elite country clubs. It requires parents to consistently model integrity, ethical behavior, and moral fortitude. When Josephine Sterling Amalinda's grandmother recognized the terminal rot in Richard, she did not just offer a whispered warning in a sunlit kitchen. She built a concrete legal failsafe to protect her granddaughter from the inevitable betrayal she knew was coming. Josephine understood that true love sometimes means preparing a child to fight the monsters living in their own house. Her foresight underscores a painful, necessary reality. Sometimes the most crucial long-term guidance a child receives is learning how to set firm boundaries against the very people who share their bloodline. We live in a complex era where the definition of family is constantly expanding and evolving, yet the core tenets of a healthy household remain entirely immutable. Honesty must be the absolute bedrock. If a family cannot rely on the truth, every interaction becomes a tense negotiation, and every relationship becomes a cold transaction. The Browns built their entire existence on a fragile foundation of lies. Fake designer bags, hidden mezzanine loans, forged signatures, and fabricated ethics grievances. When the truth finally surfaced, the collapse was total, immediate, and irreversible. They lost their estate, their freedom, and their daughter in a matter of seconds, all because they refused to live in reality. Stories like this hold a mirror up to our own lives, asking us to pause and reflect on the values we are passing down to the next generation. Are we raising our children to be resilient, ethical, and compassionate members of society? Are we actively fostering environments where fairness and emotional awareness thrive? Or are we secretly keeping a quiet ledger of our sacrifices, waiting for the day we can present a bill to our offspring? If this reflection resonates with you, if you have ever felt the sharp, lingering sting of being viewed as a burden or a financial resource by the very people who were supposed to be your ultimate sanctuary, know that your value is not determined by a fabricated invoice or a parent's unrealistic expectations. You are not alone in navigating these turbulent, often heartbreaking waters. Please follow the channel Linda Vengeance to join a supportive community that truly understands the deep, hidden dynamics of family betrayal and the quiet, undeniable power of reclaiming your own narrative. Hit subscribe, share your personal thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and stay connected as we continue to explore the intricate, often painful realities of surviving the people we call family. As the rising wail of the sirens echoed through the pristine wrought iron gates of the Boca Raton estate, it signaled much more than just the arrival of federal law enforcement. It signaled the permanent death of an illusion. Amalinda walked away from the shattered remnants of her lineage, stepping into the bright, unforgiving Florida sun with her dignity, her career, and her inheritance fully intact. But as she drove away, leaving her parents trapped inside the gilded cage of their own making, a lingering, haunting question remains suspended in the air. When the dust finally settles and the bitter legal battles conclude, what is actually left of a family that ruthlessly consumed itself? We must look at the empty chairs around our own dining tables and wonder, are the invisible bonds holding us together forged in genuine, unconditional love? Or are they merely fragile, transactional contracts, just waiting for the day the bill comes due?